This is a radical idea. At least it was for me. But if you want a reliable way to get in your creative flow whenever you want, this is the fastest and easiest way to do it. By the way, I'm Jo Vertis. I'm a composer, an artist, and the author of a book on creativity. Strangely, even though I immersed myself in a creative field for decades, and even though I spent most of my free time, my entire adult life, with other artists, writers, composers, and musicians, no one I know ever talked about this. And even though I studied in a creative field at a conservatory, it wasn't until I quit music and succumbed to a traumatic brain injury that I figured out how easy it actually is to access inspiration and get into the beautiful, effortless, spontaneous flow state that most people had as a child and that most creatives live for. What I'm about to teach you is a simple algorithmic process that anyone can follow. If you're a professional, amateur, or wanting to get started with something creative for the first time, you can use this creative process. It's so easy a child could do it. I've tested this again and again, probably hundreds of thousands of times, and it works every time. And I promise, you too can access your inspiration immediately, whenever you want, with no fuss, no rituals, no mood setting, nothing. It's right there. Just open the door and take it. Here's what you do. First, ask yourself straight up, how should I start? Now, what happens as soon as you ask that question? Do you have a thought? Maybe an image pops into your head, or a color, a word, or an emotion, some kind of vague idea? I'm betting that if you get really still and pay close attention, you will have a thought come up as soon as you ask yourself that question, how should I start? What used to happen to me was that I would immediately doubt that first thought. I'd start worrying it was a bad idea. I'd think, there's probably a better idea. I shouldn't go with the first thing I think of. I should work harder to think of the best thing. But I didn't know about the amazing reality that my creative spirit was speaking to me through my first thoughts. Those first thoughts are the golden ideas you're looking for. They're the initial steps that lead you in the direction your creativity wants to take you. The key to getting into your flow as quickly as possible is to notice your first thoughts. It's kind of mind-blowing when you realize how simple it is. You ask, and your creative spirit gives you the answer immediately. Bam! So once you've caught that first thought, like a firefly in a jar, once you've identified it and isolated it from any other thoughts or worries or emotions that might want to push it out of the way, your next step is to consider that thought as an instruction and follow it. Follow it, meaning do whatever kind of action that thought suggests. Make the gesture, grab the color, start brainstorming around the theme, or whatever action you can do in response to that thought. This is incredibly helpful because once you put your first thought into the instruction category, you no longer have any business judging it, doubting it, worrying about whether you should have chosen it, or whatever else. You can kind of separate yourself and your ego from any concerns about that idea. It's simply an instruction that you have decided to follow. This is a huge part of why this creative process works so well. Making your first thoughts into instructions is what gets you out of the way so your creativity can flow. It lowers the stakes. It takes the pressure off because this instruction isn't something precious that you spent hours deliberating about. It's something you had no choice about. If you decide in advance to play with your creativity in this way, then picking your first thought is the rule. You can't judge yourself for following the rules, so you're completely off the hook regarding how good of an idea you had in the first place. Now you're free to play with your creativity. Cool. So let's say you've identified your first thought and started working with it, and after a little while you get stuck. You need a new idea in order to continue. Easy, just ask the question you want the answer to. What should I do next? And again, listen for your first thought. Consider that thought an instruction and follow it. You can do this as often as you need to. Hey now, wait a minute. There's no way you can create a piece of art or a book or whatever and do it well by just doing the first thing you think of over and over until you decide you're finished. You're gonna need my help, obviously. Well, hello there, editor. Thank you for sharing your concern. To clarify, I'm not suggesting that the first thing that comes out of you as soon as you sit down to work is going to be a finished product. Generating creative ideas is the first part of the creative process, and no offense, but it can be utterly poisoned by bringing your editing mind in too early. What we're talking about here is how to get your creativity up and running. Just because you start the engine of your car doesn't mean you're already at your destination. But you can't get to where you're going if you don't start the motor. I'm showing you a fast, easy way to start your creativity engine. This process basically ensures you don't get tangled up with your editing mind too early. When I use this process, I'm constantly creating. I'm moving immediately from my first thought into action, and so I simply don't have time to think critically about my ideas or make any editorial decisions. I do those things much later, only after I have a substantially completed first draft. This enables me to keep judgment out of the picture while I'm working in my creative flow state, and that's how I generate my best and most inspired ideas. We can always refine them later. Let's do a bit of troubleshooting. What if you can't tell which thought was the first? When I started practicing creativity this way, I noticed I would have a bunch of little thoughts that came all in a cluster. Usually the first thought is really quiet, and then the self-doubting thoughts or competing ideas come in, and they're oftentimes a little louder. Don't worry about it if it's hard to discern which thought was actually first. Even more important than following your first thought is practicing throwing off any doubts and just getting busy working on ideas right away. So if you're not sure which thought was first, pick one that you think could have been the first one and just assume it was. Let go of any doubts about that thought and just get busy working with it. What if you just can't see how your first thought could work? Maybe you get a first thought that just seems crazy. Some of them can be really out there. Or maybe it's something you've never tried before. Maybe it sounds like it absolutely wouldn't work. You know that analogy about blindfolded people touching an elephant? None of them knows what it is they're touching. One person describes the trunk, somebody else describes the tail, and another person thinks they're touching some kind of a wall. None of them realize they're touching the same thing because they don't have a concept of the whole. It's totally normal to not understand a first thought if you don't know the context it's going to be in. But if you're using this process, you'll still be in the dark about the context itself. The context and its components can be created at the same time, which means you can't possibly know how your first thought inspirations will fit in until you get much further along. So when you have doubts about your first thoughts, what you need to do is this. You need to trust that your creativity is guiding you and choose to give control of the outcome over to it. Instead of doubting your first thoughts, practice accepting them in just the same way you'd accept your thoughts drifting while practicing mindfulness. Check out this video, if you haven't already seen it, to learn more about practicing acceptance through mindfulness. What if your first thought is an idea you'd never have the guts to do in your creative work? If you're sincerely wanting to develop your creativity, you need to decide to take on the challenge of trying something new. If you open yourself up to moving past your previous limits and going into uncharted territory, your creativity will probably blow up. This is genuinely one of the most valuable aspects of working with this creative process. When you decide ahead of time to go on the adventure your creative spirit is inviting you to, and say yes to your creativity every time, you will make all kinds of exciting discoveries. This excludes criminal behavior, and I am not responsible for what you do. Anyway, what do you have to lose? You don't have to show your explorations to anybody. Keep these creative adventures to yourself for a while. You're allowed to enjoy your creativity in the safety of privacy and explore your ideas without any concern about how other people might react to them. As you experiment and play with your creativity, you'll eventually decide if and when you want someone else to see, hear, or read what you've made. But for right now, it's just you and your creativity, and there really isn't any risk in trying something new and making a mess that no one else will ever see. If you're interested in reading the dramatic story of how my traumatic brain injury led to me coming up with this creative process, you can read about it in my book. I also wrote about how this process changed my life, but for now, suffice it to say, it has completely transformed me. Because now, instead of spending all kinds of time agonizing over whether or not my ideas are good enough and working so hard to decide what to do next, I just commit to my first thoughts. Instead of taking hours, the decision process only takes a split second. I spend no time deliberating and all of my creative time playing, working, and learning how to make stuff I like even better through all the experience I gain by just making more stuff in less time. This tool helped me remove the blocks that were in the way of my creativity, heal trauma to my creative spirit, quit judging myself, and get past my fear so I could finally enjoy a thriving, prolific, blissful relationship with my creativity. Whether you're a professional creative or a total beginner, I truly believe it'll be valuable for you to experiment with this process. If you commit to exploring these little first thought inspirations that your creative spirit gives you, I guarantee you will discover treasures inside your creativity that you had no idea were there. Nope, I don't like this. This makes me feel yucky and scared, which means it's bad. If it's so easy like she says, then we're beyond this conversation. I'm better than this. That's why I've been put in control. No changing is necessary. We'll keep things nice and the same, which is safe. Which means I've done my job, keeping us safe. That's what I do by being the best and never making mistakes. Phew, that was a close one. Hey, ego. I was wondering when you'd show up. I understand this might be a little scary. I know you want to keep us safe and show us in a good light. But trust me, there's a brilliant source of inspiration behind our first thoughts. If you'll cooperate with us utilizing all of our resources, we'll ultimately create things you'll feel even better about. It's gonna be okay. Let's just experiment with a new way of doing things for a bit and see how it goes. If this creative process feels scary, silly, or not serious enough for your ego to get on board with, you can just thank your ego for its intention to help you make things that will reflect well on you, and then ask it to be quiet for a bit while you try this out. Again, you don't have to show your work to anyone, so you're not risking anything by experimenting. Let's wrap up. This whole process I've been describing in this video is what I call the flow formula. Here's a quick review. Step 1, ask yourself, what's the next step? Step 2, notice the first thought that comes when you ask that question. Step 3, consider that thought to be an instruction and follow it. When you feel stuck, repeat steps 1 through 3. As you work with this process, you can use mindfulness to notice any thoughts of judgment that come up. Kindly acknowledge and accept the fact that your mind has drifted, and gently return your attention to the activity of creating. I'm super curious to hear about how the flow formula impacts your creative life. If you decide to try it, please let me know in the comments. Your likes, shares, and subscribes will help my channel grow. So if you feel like this video was helpful, I would greatly appreciate that support. I hope you have a wonderful day with your creativity, my friend. See you next time. Bye.